Hello, Farm Connections viewers. We wanted to take a moment at the top of the show to thank you for your continued support of Farm Connections, especially during this difficult time. As you may have noticed, we are staying close to home and filming our interviews through Zoom. We've taken this cautionary approach to make sure that we are being respectful for the concerns of health of our guests, as well as ourselves. Please know that once we feel it's appropriate, we'll get back out in the field. Thank you again for watching and enjoy the show. Now, on to Farm Connections.
Hello and welcome to Farm Connections. I'm your host, Dan Hoffman. On today's program, we have a special treat as we sit down with storyteller and show contributor JoAnne Lower to learn more about her history and how she comes up with the stories that she shares. We discuss the future of small business and the options available to them with Chris Hahn of CEDA, and the University of Minnesota provides us with a new Best Practices segment. All here today on Farm Connections.
Welcome to Farm Connections with your host, Dan Hoffman.
Farm Connections made possible in part by
Absolute Energy. A locally owned facility produces 125 million gallons of ethanol annually, proudly supporting local economies in Iowa and Minnesota. Absolute Energy, adding value to the neighborhood. The Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, collaborating with businesses and entrepreneurs to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. You can learn more at auri.org.
Welcome to Farm Connections. We're so honored today to have JoAnne Lower. JoAnne's no stranger to our audience. She's a poet, an author, and a storyteller. She's been on many episodes and really well received by our audience. Welcome, JoAnne.
Thank you, Dan. I am so honored to be with you today.
Your stories are so authentic and you grab the attention of people everywhere you tell them, including on Farm Connections. Can you take us back to how you started this passion and this really good thing you do of telling stories?
I was just a little girl when every Tuesday night my dad liked to go to the sale barn. Mom didn't want to stay home, so my two brothers and I went along. We all sat in the back seat, and when I wanted to go into the sale barn, Dad would say, "No, JoAnne, there are too many bad smells, too many bad words. You can't come in with me." So Mom, in order to keep us entertained, would start a story, then have me continue, and my brothers after that. So it's been a long time.
So Mother was a storyteller as well?
She was a teacher, and she really encouraged me in speaking.
Well, she did a great job. And what a tribute to your family and your upbringing and your rural roots. What else do you remember about those early storytelling times?
I guess when I first started being serious about writing my stories was when I moved to Mayo Clinic, Rochester, had a job there. But a small town girl from the Midwest has quite a hard time in a big city and at Mayo Clinic, and I was lost everywhere. So I would come home, sit on my kitchen floor with a tablet and a pencil, and I would just move into a story growing up on the farm. And then I could find myself, and then I felt comfortable.
JoAnne, how do you take a story from a concept to a finished product? Tell us about that.
Someone will say something to me. I particularly remember a woman asking me what she could buy for her kids for Christmas that they would always remember. And I thought, there's nothing you can wrap up and put a bow around that they're always going to remember. So I went home that day, sat on my kitchen floor with my tablet and my pencil, and I wrote the story called Just an Old Cardboard Angel. That was a story about my dad coming home on Christmas Eve after his corn picker accident. If that's how I start with a story, you might say something to me that would trigger a story in me. I would come home and write it. So I write it on a tablet, I type it into my computer, and when I am asked to speak for a particular group, I will go through the stories that I have and decide what would fit for that group of people, and then go over the story. And the funny thing is, the more I tell the story, just like any of us, the more it takes on a life of its own.
Well, JoAnne, I've mentioned how our audience really appreciates your stories. What's your favorite interaction with your audience?
I think it was one time when I was speaking at the fairgrounds in Mason City, and there were about 400 people there. And I guess I was afraid to do one of the stories that I did. It was a story about my brother Jim and I going back to the farm 4 miles south of town to just see the farm again, go through the barn, go through the house, see the pigeons in the haymow. It was so much fun. But at the end of that story, it's a very sad story that took me about 12 years to write, Dan, because it was so painful. The beginning of it is so fun. It's such a great time. But that was the last day I ever saw my brother. He died a couple of years after, and of a brain aneurysm. He was my best friend. And so I was afraid to tell that story because I didn't think anyone would want something sad at the end of the story. And after I was finished, there was a man who came up to me and said, "JoAnne, thank you so much for telling us that story about your brother. I lost my brother too. Mm-hmm. Now I can tell people about him."
Have you taken your storytelling to elementary schools, of course, in normal times when you can do that, or other young people's groups?
All kinds of groups. The furthest my storytelling has taken me was to Hong Kong. And I was there for a week telling stories to all the kids at the school, one class at a time. And one night, all the teachers too. And that was quite an experience.
That's an amazing experience. And what an opportunity. What did you learn from that experience of traveling to Hong Kong and a unique culture to us and a different geographic place? What did you take away from that?
Well, first of all, the kids could speak several languages. These are kindergartners. And so smart and so educated. And I remember particularly, and I can send you pictures of this, one little boy whom I had told a story to the whole class. And he sat there with tears running down his cheeks, and he said, "I had to move away from my best friend, and I miss him so much." The story that I told them had nothing to do with that, but for some reason, that's what triggered the story in this beautiful little boy. It was such an honor to be there with them.
Well, there's a thread that ties all of humanity together.
Mm-hmm.
How about their educational system and their reaction to your stories and you as a storyteller?
The kids were kids, and they were so attentive. They were so much fun. What surprised me was the teachers, in that maybe it was a mandatory thing for them to have to come hear me that night, I don't know. But what was shocking and incredible for me was because I had told my stories, then they wanted to tell theirs. And I guess, Dan, that's why I tell them, not just to change people's hearts, but to give people permission to tell their story, to give people courage to tell their own.
Well, you model it well. What a great example. JoAnne, anything else you'd like to tell the audience of Farm Connections today?
I am just so honored to be a part of Farm Connections. I had watched it several times before I contacted you, Dan, and you were so generous, so wonderful to allow me to be on your show. And now it's just fun, and I love it.
Well,
so thank you.
You're welcome. We love you too, and so does the audience. And that's really what public broadcasting and KSMQ is about. It is the people's television. It is the people's media, and you really help us show that. Thank you so much, JoAnne Lower.
Thank you, Dan.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections Best Practices, brought to you by
This is Brad Carlson, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension in Water Resources and Crops. I work out of our regional office in Mankato, and I work statewide. And this is today's Best Practices segment. Today we're going to talk about variable rate nitrogen, and it's a subject that I've been working a lot with over the last several years. There's been an explosion in the availability of technologies, both to give nitrogen rate advisement for farmers in corn, but also for making prescriptions for variable rate nitrogen. And there's three broad categories of these technologies. One of them is sensing technologies, which either measure the color of the crop, the growing crop, or they analyze an image of the crop. So this technology has not been shown to be particularly promising, because typically when the crop turns yellow, that's kind of what we're analyzing for, is the greenness of the crop, we've already lost yield. And so that type of technology may be useful when it comes to making a rescue treatment if we've had some severe weather or extreme conditions where we know we've lost a lot of nitrogen and we have to come back and try and rescue the crop. But as far as making upfront management decisions, it appears to not be timely enough. So the other two types of technologies are, one, to use a sample-based approach, which would be to either take a soil sample or a tissue sample from the plant, analyze it for sufficiency, and then make a rate recommendation. Or the other would be to simply use a computer model to predict what the nitrogen status is on the site and of the crop, as well as what the weather's been like and what it probably is going to be like through the end of the growing season, and then make a rate recommendation from that. So if we look at the performance of the variable rate nitrogen technologies, what we discover is that a large percentage of the time they make a rate recommendation that's actually below university guidelines. And that's exactly what we would expect based on our experience doing rate studies. And so if we think about this, the lower rate that's being recommended is what is necessary to achieve optimum yield, or in essence, you wouldn't get any higher yield with more nitrogen, and so therefore you've already achieved maximum yield. What that means is the only way you're going to pay for this technology, and there is a per acre cost, is through fertilizer cost savings. And so really it's only under the small number of times that we see a yield increase that we actually see more grain being produced in order to pay for the technology. And that's actually what we've observed in using the rate recommendation technologies, particularly the computer models. What I would suggest to farmers is, if you want to use the variable rate nitrogen technologies, they're certainly very interesting to try. I would suggest doing field trials with them where you compare the recommended rate from the technology versus simply using a flat rate. Make sure that you put in random strips, don't just simply split the field, and make sure you do appropriate analysis of the yield. We're always willing to help you at the university to do that. Just simply contact us and we'll give you some advice and some pointers on how to accomplish that. This is Brad Carlson, and this has been our Best Practices segment.
Today we have Chris Hahn from CEDA to talk a little bit about economic development in southern Minnesota. Chris, welcome to Farm Connections.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I'm excited to be here.
Well, what does the acronym CEDA stand for?
So CEDA stands for Community and Economic Development Associates. And what we do is we are contracted out to communities. For example, in my case, I'm contracted to the City of Grand Meadow, City of Leroy, Spring Valley, as well as Fillmore County. And what we do is we work with the EDAs in those towns and really try to connect people with people and businesses with resources to help that community grow.
Chris, why is that important?
Well, the small business is really the driving factor of our communities, especially rurally. You look at our rural communities and the local grocers, the flower shops, the small business auto repair, those types of things, that really is the economic driver of these small communities. And in southern Minnesota, agriculture is the biggest of the drivers for all of our communities across the southern region. So,
well, on Farm Connections, we do an awful lot of work with farm families and agriculture. Why should they care about CEDA and our smaller communities?
well, the one thing CEDA can bring to the table is we have a really diverse team of over 30 people. And what I mean by that is, for example, I have a business degree and a master's in education. We have people on our team that are expert grant writers. We have people on our team that have degrees in economic development. We have people on our team that come out of the corporate world. So the nice thing about working with CEDA is when you work with one of us, you really work with over 30 of us. So on any given day, we may send emails to our teams and say, hey, I have this situation. And of those 30 people, 5 might respond and say, I've dealt with this before. Have you tried this? Have you checked this resource? Those types of things. So what it is, it's an effective way for smaller communities to leverage those resources that they may not have readily available in their community and move forward from there.
Well, farm families and agriculture is no stranger to using resources wisely, and also sometimes having resources that aren't as abundant as perhaps larger populated areas. But there's enough advantages to offset that. So how do you use the resources wisely inside of that context?
Well, I think, again, for us, it's the resources are there and they may not always be aware of each other. So they may have a great partnership that needs to be facilitated, but they may not be aware of it. And I'll use the example of my background. I have an undergraduate degree in business. I have a master's in education. So when we talk about workforce development, I can understand it from the corporate mindset of this is what it's going to cost me. This is my investment in my employees. But I also understand it from the facilitation of the education side of it. And I've often said, education may be right here and business may be right here, and they never get a chance to reach across. So as it relates to the farm communities, some of the work that we do is exactly that. So we were going to have an agriculture summit this year in Fillmore County. And what that was is we had speakers come in on the topics of succession planning, sustainability, alternative crops, emotional wellness for ag families, those types of topics. And what it's about is about awareness and accessibility to these farm families, that these resources are there. There is an abundance of them. Here's how you access them. So that's really what we try to do.
How are small businesses and agriculture and rural communities connected?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that farms are a business. And I say that because it sounds like everybody knows that. And when you get into larger population centers, they don't necessarily look at it that way. So, I look at the economy as a whole and you see the farmers, but then you see the implement dealers and you see the service shops and you see all these other things, the feeds, the co-ops, everything else. And, our role there is, again, to look at it and say, hey, some of you are already collaborating. Some of you have a great opportunity to collaborate, and how do we maximize the value of that partnership? And to pull something from education, partnerships create value in an organization or in a community. So value is created when it's up, the two partners come together and combine their efforts, resources, and passions. So
you've been working on business after hours. Can you elaborate just a bit on that as well?
Yeah, business after hours is not a new concept, but it's just as important, if not more so important, in smaller communities as larger communities. And really what it's about is networking. We get people there, we learn about our different skill sets, and oftentimes it might not even be what you do for your 9-to-5 job or your daily job. It might be something that you're passionate about on the side. I look at my job now is really work for education. I'm sorry, my job now is actually economic development. But my passion is really more workforce development education. So that helps inform me as to how to relate to different organizations. Business after hours is the same thing. You may have a small business owner who owns, a flower shop or a mechanic's shop or something like that, but they may be passionate about something else. So that person can often form a relationship and maybe do some mentoring or some consulting or those types of things, and really utilize the collective skill set of the community. I mean, that's what it's really about.
Well, recently we've had lots of changes economically and a bit of disruption to supply-demand chains with COVID-19. What have been your observations working in economic development during this time?
It's been a challenge, but I will say the resiliency of the small business owners has really been impressive. And I say that because you'll reach out, you'll contact people, hey, how's it going? We know there's challenges. Some businesses are doing well right now. I mean, agriculture as a whole is doing okay because they're in the field. It's that time of year seasonally. It may impact them less than it might impact a small gift shop or something like that. But it's challenging for them, but I do appreciate the resiliency of the small business owner. They don't want a loan, they don't want a handout, they want to find out what their resources are to work through this. And our job really in the last month and a half is to make sure that we do a good job of telling everybody and communicating to these business owners and outreach and saying, here's some situations or some opportunities that might help you with the situation. And honestly, a lot of that is just to reach out and say, hey, how you doing? Are you okay? We get so tied up sometimes, I think, in the top line, bottom line profitability sales that it's okay to just reach out as a person and say, hey, how are you? How are you doing? So that's what we're seeing. I mean, it's challenging. The requirements seem to change daily or get modified, but we're just staying on top of it and trying to let everybody know that they're not alone. We'll get through this and we'll get through it together, but we're here.
Chris, every job has good days, bad days. If we could take one of your greatest challenges and then follow up with one of your greatest rewards in your work.
Oh, that's a great question. I think one of my greatest challenges, my greatest challenge really in the last year is trying to get out and meet people and trying to have that face-to-face conversation with business owners. And it's a challenge because there's just not enough time in the day to do it. In promoting the Agriculture Summit, which again subsequently was canceled, I got to go into the communities and hand out flyers and learn about your business and learn about people in the community that are doing this, or and there's always that part of the conversation is, you should talk to this person. Absolutely. I'd love to talk to that person, So that's probably the biggest challenge. And honestly, it's probably one of the biggest rewards too, because once you start doing that and you start making these connections, you put that person's either their passion or their business or what they like to do or what they're good at or their experience, you kind of file it away. And then you may be talking to another business owner and say, hey, you know what? I know someone who's had experience. I know someone that might be a good person to talk to. I had that the other day. We had someone looking at starting a small business, and the person happened to be from my hometown. I said, hey, have you talked to so-and-so? Because they did that in my hometown for 30 years. He said, no, I haven't, but that's a really good idea. Because again, we both knew the person. We just hadn't had that conversation and kind of turned up the ideas as to how to best approach it. So,
Chris, thank you for the work you do. And I hope that you find good connections in our communities and you reach out continually. You're doing great work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I loved speaking with you this morning. And like I said, if we can help anybody, let me know.
Thanks again, Chris Hahn from CEDA. This is Dan Hoffman, Farm Connections. Stay tuned for more.
With ethanol usage down due to fewer people on the road and hand sanitizer in greater demand because of the COVID-19 outbreak, it only made sense for ethanol plants to sell their product for additional sanitizers. That is what the Elkhorn Ethanol plant in Claremont, Minnesota has been doing, and doing successfully. Randy Doyle is the CEO of the company.
We are choosing a spot in our production line where we've got the highest purity. And we've got that piped separately to separate tanks and separate loadout and everything. So yes, we can do that, and we are.
How does alcohol from an ethanol plant work for sanitizers? Doyle says it works very well, and it has opened up a temporary market for some plants.
Yeah, it's a market for now. Understand that FDA gave that guidance that allowed ethanol producers like ourselves to do this, but it's for a limited time. It's only while the emergency orders are on. And at the very latest, that expires the end of this year.
While numerous ethanol plants across the country shut down or reduced their production, Elkhorn kept running and buying corn, but producing ethanol at a lower rate. As more states begin to resume normal activities, Doyle says production is ramping up.
We just kicked our production up to full rate because that's what the market is telling us right now. Market's come back some, and I think people have gotten stir crazy being boxed up and they're starting to drive more. So we're hearing more from our normal fuel ethanol customers, and there's demand out there that we're trying to meet.
In the short term, there's no question using alcohol for hand sanitizer is a boost for the ethanol industry. However, in the long term, it's not the market they really need. They need people in their cars driving using ethanol. This is Lynn Kettleson reporting.
We are all part of a greater tapestry of stories, each generation sharing traditions down through the years. When we think about the legacy of those who have come before us, it puts into perspective our place in that tapestry and how future generations will remember us. I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for watching.